I picked up this dresser off of Facebook Marketplace for $50. And this video is going to be a rustic farmhouse, Scandinavian, Scandi rustic farmhouse, cozy Scandi rustic farmhouse makeover of a super antique dresser. I knew this piece was solid wood and super old as soon as I saw the picture of it on Facebook. But once we got it home and I had a chance to have a little bit closer look at it, I got really excited by the craftsmanship and beautiful hand-built details on this piece. This is a shaker style dresser from somewhere around 1850. It's built of huge, thick planks of oak, a mix of hand-forged nails and massive machine screws. It has hand-carved dovetail joints and was built to last. It's already been refinished more than once, and the lady that I bought it from had already started painting some of it with a duck egg blue latex paint. You all know that I have no problem with people painting their furniture, but I just couldn't picture this dresser in anything other than a bare wood state. The first thing that I wanted to do to this dresser was pull out all of the drawers and take a look for anything that might need repairs. All of the drawers slide in and out of their spots beautifully, smoothly, so I wasn't worried about that. But I did see that somewhere along the line, someone had replaced the original metal drawer stops with some new wooden pieces. That is because of this. Quite frequently when it's a wood on wood situation in the drawers, that wood wears down and the metal drawer stops start to dig into the bottom of the drawers. Luckily for me though, whoever had this last had already made those repairs, and I'm just going to need to go back and replace a few of the little wooden stops. I also wanted to give the entire dresser a really thorough cleaning. I decided to use just some Dawn dish soap in hot water with a few drops of bleach. There was some evidence of mice living in this dresser at some point. I don't think there has been a furry friend living in here for quite some time, but adding a little bit of bleach to my cleaning solution just gave me some extra peace of mind. As I cleaned each drawer, I also went ahead and pulled the old wood knobs off. They just don't make things like they used to. These knobs have been on this dresser since 1850 with nothing more than tension and a wood dowel. There were two knobs that had been repaired at some point, and I love finding little treasures like this in furniture. They actually used some cut up thread spools as spacers to screw in the knobs. I gave the dresser a few hours to dry off really well, and then it was time to start sanding. I do really love that authentic alligator texture that is on the drawers, but that previous finish is sticky. It's tacky to the touch, and that is not cool. It's gotta go. So I started off sanding the large flat surfaces with my Ryobi random orbital sander. I really love this sander. I got it for Christmas and it has been fantastic for me. I think it is a great, affordable, and approachable machine for beginners, and also can stand up to seasoned woodworkers and refinishers. Ryobi also makes a triangular detail sander called the Corner Cat, and I'll leave both of those linked down in the description box below. And while I'm sanding away here, I wanted to talk to you guys about sandpaper in terms of furniture painting and refinishing. I get asked so frequently about how to know what grit of sandpaper to use, so this seems like the perfect time to break that down. When you're at the hardware store, you're going to see numbers like 80, 100, 220. So here's what those numbers mean. The higher the number, the smaller the grains and the finer the sandpaper grit. Conversely, lower numbers indicate larger grains and an overall coarser sandpaper. For furniture, a coarse sandpaper would range from 80 to 100 grit. This paper is aggressive and will remove a lot of material quickly, especially when you're using a mechanical sander like this. I use a coarse grit to break through hard varnish or lacquered finishes quickly, but you need to be very careful if you're using a really coarse grit like this, because it will very quickly flatten out a curved edge or tear through veneer. I'm really only using an 80 grit right now because this is solid, thick wood, and a lot of sanding isn't going to damage anything. On a piece of veneer, I would be more likely to start with something a little softer, like a 100 or a 120 grit. A medium grit sandpaper would be 120 to 220 grit. These are good multi-purpose grits. You can often use these to remove old finishes, and they're also good for buffing out scratches and smoothing out the rough texture that's left by a coarser grit of sandpaper. 220 is kind of the standard grit used for scuff sanding when it comes to furniture painting. Not really strong enough to break through the original finish, but enough to create a fine texture on a shiny surface for your paint to grab onto. 220 is also the most common grit of sandpaper that's used for distressing. A fine sandpaper would be anything above 220. For instance, I usually use a 320 or a 400 grit if I need to sand between coats of paint or top coat. It's more of a polish than anything else to help remove very slight imperfections in your finish. To remove the previous finish that was on this dresser and get a really nice, smooth, clean surface, I started with an 80 grit sandpaper and then gradually worked my way up through a 100, a 120, and my final grit was a 180. To help me get into the corners or any smaller details, I switched out to my Surf Prep 3x4 electric ray sander. This is a professional grade sander that comes with a professional grade price tag. I completely understand that it's not in everybody's budget, but the Ryobi Corner Cat triangle shaped sander that I mentioned is a really great affordable alternative to get into these tight areas, or you could just sand them by hand. To help me out on these chunky legs, I grabbed a little bit of paint and varnish stripper and applied it with a disposable chip brush. Once I had a good amount of stripper on the feet, I wrapped them in saran wrap to help keep the stripper wet while it dissolved that varnish. The stripper that I used today needs about 30 minutes to do its thing, so once that time had passed, I removed the saran wrap and grabbed some fine steel wool to start sanding and scrubbing away that finish. Once the feet were dry, I still had a ton of sanding to do, and the best way for me to get into all of these details and around these curves was really just to sit down, put on a podcast, and sand this by hand. So much sanding, and I'm not done yet. The last thing I needed to sand were these wood knobs, and I could have done it by hand like I did the legs, but these are tiny and fiddly. So I grabbed my multi-purpose rotary tool and a sanding disc just to get as much of this varnish and stain off as quickly as I could. This worked out really well for me. I don't reach for this tool often, not nearly as often as I think I should, so I'm gonna make an effort to make my life easier, and you may be seeing this little rotary tool a lot more often on the channel. While I was sanding the drawers, I noticed that there was one drawer that had a little split in the wood, so I'm gonna need to fix that before I move on to anything else. I grabbed some of my favorite Gorilla wood glue and one of my craft syringes to apply the glue into that split. Once I had the damage saturated with wood glue, I just clamped it, let it dry for a few hours, and then came back and gave that area of glue another quick sand to remove any excess. I also need to replace the drawer stops. These just help the drawer from sliding back too far into the body of the dresser. They just catch that bottom lip of the drawer so that it sits flush with the front of the frame. One of my favorite way to replace these is just with a cut up paint stir stick. They're free from the hardware store and you can't beat that. I just applied a little bit of glue to the back, put them in place where I wanted them, and then grabbed some small finishing nails just to tack them into place. Another little trick that I've learned along the way is to use a pair of needle nose pliers just to hold small nails in place while you get them started so that you don't hit your chubby little sausage fingers with the hammer. I gave everything a really good wipe down with a tack cloth to remove all of my sanding dust, and then I was ready to mix up some paint wash. Don't worry, I'm not painting the dresser per se. I just want to preserve this really natural bare wood look that we have. So I mixed up some House and Canvas chalk style paint in the color linen with a whole lot of water. I used my Zebra chiseled wedge paintbrush to apply this very watered down paint over each surface, working one section at a time. And then I immediately came back with a shop rag and removed any excess. Wood will naturally continue to oxidize and darken over time. So this light wash of paint, or a faux stain you could call it, is really just going to help keep the color more consistent, and it's also going to even out any blotchy spots in the wood. The last thing I want to deal with is the painted insides of the drawers. This is latex paint on raw wood. I'm not going to bother stripping it, but it does have quite a lot of bleed through, being that it's on raw wood. So I grabbed my favorite stain blocking primer, Bin Shellac Base Primer, and gave the insides of all of the drawers a quick coat of that. And when my primer had dried, I used the same linen color from House and Canvas that I used for my paint wash, only this time in full strength, to repaint the interiors of all of the drawers. To reattach the knobs, I used just a tiny amount of my wood glue around the dowels and popped them back into place. I don't want to use too much glue here in case someone in the future wants to refinish this piece again, which I'm sure will happen down the line, and I'd like them to be able to remove these knobs as easily as I was for their refinishing process. For the last little finishing touches, I got up super early in the morning while everyone else was still in bed, poured myself a cup of coffee, and touched up the edges of the drawers with my paint wash. I also added a little bit of beeswax to the drawer runners to keep them gliding smoothly, and now this makeover is complete.
Say something like you love me and make my day, like you always do, like you always do. Hold my hand and look me in the eyes so I can tell you how I feel, tell you how I feel. Every day is something new if I spend it with you, with you, with you.
You probably noticed that I haven't sealed this piece yet, which is the last step of all of my furniture flips. And that is simply because I'm not quite sure which route I want to go. I'm pretty sure I want to avoid any kind of gloss that I would get from a poly, so I will probably end up doing a clear furniture wax or maybe even some hemp oil just to rehydrate and condition the old wood. Whether I choose wax or hemp oil, the finish and the color will stay the same once those products are applied and have a chance to soak in. Thank you so much for hanging out with me again today. Make sure that you leave me a thumbs up, a comment down below, subscribe before you go, and I'm gonna leave a few more bare wood furniture makeovers over here that I think you might like to watch next. I'll catch you guys next time.
what you do.